I'm up here now, not in a grand way, just standing quietly on the porch, watching the wind comb through the pine trees behind the house I grew up in. The dinner is over, the table's been cleared, but I can still hear them forks, clinking voices layered, someone laughing a little too loud at a joke that had no punchline. I remember exactly where I sat. I remember not speaking. It's strange the way silence holds shape long after sound fades. I wasn't quiet because I was unsure. I was quiet because the room was full of people who already believed they knew my story. And when people think they know your story, they stop listening. They used to listen. A long time ago, before I left North Carolina, before my father died, before the version of me they liked became a version I could no longer be. I had not planned on coming back for this dinner. My brother sent a group text 2 nights ago. Erin's celebration dinner, 6 p.m., don't be late. There was no "Hi, Maya," no "We'd love to see you," no question of whether I could make it. Just logistics. I suppose they figured I was still drifting around somewhere in Colorado with no real obligations. They weren't wrong about the Colorado part. They just didn't know what I had been doing there. I arrived alone. Erin's house looked just like the photos, big beige decorated in that coastal farmhouse style they all seemed to love. There were candles and calligraphy and one of those wall signs that said, "Grateful, thankful, blessed." A quiet part of me wondered if anyone here felt any of those things. When I stepped inside, no one rushed to greet me. My sister glanced up from a conversation about charcuterie boards and waved me toward the back. "We saved you a seat near the window," she said. I wasn't sure if it was kindness or strategy. Either way, I took it. The seat put me 3 chairs away from anyone I knew well. My mother sat beside Aunt Deidre. My cousin Matthew, fresh out of law school, took center stage retelling a story about a courtroom slip-up that made everyone roar with laughter. No one asked how I was. No one asked where I'd been. I passed the bread. I nodded along. I listened as someone made a passing comment about the bohemian cousin who wandered off years ago and never came back. They laughed. They didn't even glance in my direction. And I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was not angry. I was just done. They talked about jobs and kids and housing markets. My cousin Erin had just landed a pediatric fellowship in Boston, and everyone was calling her the future Dr. Keller like it was a royal title. She deserved it truly. She had worked hard. But the way they spoke around me, loud enough to exclude but not confront, reminded me that in this house, hard work meant something only if it came with letters after your name and a predictable mailing address. Aunt Deidre leaned across the table at one point and said, "Maya, are you still doing that volunteer thing? What was it again? Forest? Cleanup?" It was not worth correcting her. I smiled. "Still working on the wildfire teams," I said. "Oh, that's right," she chirped as if I'd just reminded her I collected stamps. "That's so brave. Though I imagine at some point you'll want something a little more stable. Maybe closer to home?" I nodded once. "At some point." She turned back to her salad. What none of them knew, what they never once asked, was that I'd spent the last 4 years working as a logistical coordinator for FEMA's Western Wildfire Division. I helped design evacuation protocols. I stood in ash-covered hills at 3 a.m., tracking wind shifts and rerouting air support. I ran mobilization drills with people who carried the weight of towns on their shoulders. I wasn't drifting. I was building, quietly, consistently, without a photo album or a Christmas card update. But to them, I was still the girl who had dropped her grad school plans and moved out west for a break. They didn't want my reality. They wanted their version of me, the one they could dismiss. And I let them have it. Because I did not come for them. I came for someone else. Tomorrow would be 5 years since my father passed. A decorated Marine. A man who believed in action, not applause. We used to talk in the mornings just after sunrise. He'd call me captain and ask what fires I'd be flying toward next. After he died, I stopped updating the family. They didn't care. But I had kept one promise to him, one that mattered more than any family dinner could. I had reached out to his old commanding officer, Colonel James Stratton. He had responded within hours. "If it's for your father, I will be there," he wrote. "And I will come in uniform. They don't know he's coming. They don't know what I asked him to do. And they certainly don't know what it will mean when a man like him walks into that house tomorrow and addresses the one daughter no one here ever really saw. I wonder what their faces will look like. But only for a moment. Because I'm not doing this for the faces. I'm doing it for the silence that came before. The kind you don't fill with noise but with truth. And the truth is, I never wasted my life. They just weren't watching the right parts of it. Have you ever been erased by your own family, not because you failed, but because you simply didn't follow their script? Tell me below. I think more of us are out there than they realize. Dinner plates were cleared, and the tablecloth creased, stained, and dotted with wine had started to resemble something like a battlefield. One where the weapons were words, soft-voiced insinuations, and the small, practiced glances that let you know who did and did not belong. Most of the younger cousins had floated to the living room by now, drinks in hand, settling into safe little corners of conversation. The ones left behind, the older aunts, the mothers, the people who still remembered what this house used to mean, stayed gathered at the table, quietly tidying, sipping, or continuing low-effort chatter about nothing important. I was still there, peeling the label from my water bottle, letting my silence work harder than anything I could say aloud. That's when I heard it. "I still think she ran away after George died," Aunt Deidre said lightly, not even glancing in my direction. "You remember how close they were. She couldn't handle it. That's why she never came back." My mother, across from her, took a beat. "I don't think it's that simple," she replied. "Maya always had this wild streak. George couldn't rein her in, and Lord knows I never could." Her voice wasn't bitter, just distant. It would have hurt less if she'd said it with anger. But detachment. That stung deeper. That was how you spoke about someone who had already disappeared, someone you'd stopped trying to understand. To her, I wasn't independent. I was lost. Not chosen, I was adrift. The kind of woman people quietly agreed had missed her window. That was when I looked up. "I didn't run," I said, steady and clear. Deidre's fingers froze on her napkin. My mother looked at me just slightly. I held the space. "When Dad died, I didn't disappear. I went where I was needed. He understood that. You never asked. They didn't speak. Maybe they hadn't expected me to. Maybe they'd gotten too used to my silence." My mother exhaled gently. "Oh, Maya," she said, "you always make it about being needed. There's nothing wrong with just being with family." Family. That word again. Their favorite label for a place I was supposed to feel grateful just to occupy. But this wasn't family. It was a table arranged around metrics: who bought what house, who married whom, whose child got into Johns Hopkins. Love wasn't present here. Just performance. Polished performance. Mine didn't fit the decor. I thought about the badge my father mailed me during my first season on the wildfire team. It said "Unsung and Unstoppable." I had sewn it inside my field pack right next to a faded photo of us on the porch the day before I left North Carolina for good. When I called him from Montana after my first 19-hour shift, too tired to stand, too proud to cry, he only said one thing. "Captain, I hope you know the world doesn't always know how to thank people like you. That's why we don't do it for the thanks." He was the only one who ever called me that, Captain. And when he died, the calls stopped. The questions stopped. So I stopped sending updates. No one noticed, except one person. 3 weeks ago, I sent one message. To the only man my father had ever spoken of with reverence, Colonel James Stratton. He was my father's commanding officer, the man who taught him what loyalty and integrity looked like outside of war. I told him the date. I told him the address. And I asked him respectfully if he would be willing to come, to honor my father's memory and mine. He replied in under an hour. "If it's for George, I'll be there." and I will come in uniform. No one here knew that. Not my mother, not Deidre, not my sister with the charcuterie board. Tomorrow, when Colonel Stratton walked through that door in full dress blues, he would not be there for anyone else. He would be there for me, for my father's daughter, the one no one here had bothered to see. I stood and took my glass to the kitchen. My mother's hand brushed mine briefly as I passed. It was meant to be tender, but tenderness too late just feels like decoration. I didn't respond. I rinsed the glass, dried it carefully, and set it back on the rack. From the living room, someone called my name. Maya, we're opening gifts in the den. Coming. I looked down at my watch, then toward the window. In a minute, I said, not moving. Outside, the wind was picking up. The sky was already darkening the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. I stepped onto the porch and let the air settle around me. Cool, clean, sharp with pine. They didn't know who I'd become. They didn't know what I'd built. They didn't know what it took to coordinate helicopter rescues in Colorado smoke storms or to track fire patterns that moved faster than wind. They didn't know about the trauma briefings I led, the late nights I slept in steel trailers, or the way I taught a rookie team to read fire by color. They thought I was a drifter. But tomorrow, when a colonel saluted me in front of them all, the silence would be a kind I would welcome. Not painful, just finally understood. The morning came in quietly like fog rolling off the lake, soft, slow, uninvited. I woke before the sun. No alarm, just memory. 5 years to the day since I last heard him say, "Where are the fires this week?" Captain, half teasing, always proud. 5 years since someone in my family looked at me without the lens of disappointment clouding their gaze. At 6:03 a.m., I left the hotel. I didn't go straight to errands. I needed time, stillness, a stretch of road that didn't expect anything from me. So I turned north, following the service road that wrapped around Lake Lister, the same route Dad took me on when he taught me to drive stick shift. I could still hear him. It's not about controlling the machine. It's about listening to it. Shift before the change forces you. Back then, I thought he meant the clutch. Now I know he meant life. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled over near the fire tower trailhead. The pine trees leaned in like they remembered me. I stepped out, zipped my jacket, and followed the path into a clearing kissed with dew. The air was cool and resin-sweet. This was where I told him I wasn't going to law school. I expected a lecture. I got a nod. "Then don't disappear," he said. "Make sure your life still leaves a trail." And I had. They just never bothered to follow it. To my family, I had vanished, slipped away to Colorado, untethered and uncertain. But I hadn't drifted. I had deployed. There was a night near Taos I still carry in my bones. The Calwood fire had turned suddenly east faster than forecasted. The wind was wrong. I was in the ops tent when we lost contact with Bravo team. 12 firefighters, mid-ridge. I checked the live burn map, and my stomach dropped. They were boxed in fire to the west, smoke too thick for choppers. I grabbed the radio. The senior captain was frozen. I wasn't. "Redirect the drop zone," I said. "Now. We can cut a corridor if we hit the saddle point. If I was wrong, we'd lose them." I wasn't wrong. The chopper made the drop. Water cut through the heat just wide enough for our people to scramble through the gap. One by one, they emerged from the smoke, smeared in ash, shaking but alive. Luis found me later, by the trucks. He didn't say much, just clapped me on the back and said, "Hell of a call, Captain." That's who I was out there. Not a runaway, not the bohemian cousin who wandered off. I was the steady hand in crisis. The voice people waited for on the other end of the radio. I didn't have a framed degree, but I trained crews across 4 states. I mapped terrain evacuations. I slept in tin trailers, built triage tents on soccer fields where melted lunchboxes still lay in the dirt. I led trauma briefings after crews pulled charred bodies from basements. I moved with purpose. Not to be seen, but to be useful. And still, no one back home had asked a single question. They didn't know I'd been promoted to regional field strategist. They didn't know about the night I hauled a rookie down a ravine on my shoulders when the fire line shifted. They didn't know I taught my teams to read flames by their color and their sound. They didn't know, because they didn't want to. In that house, success came in approved packaging, mortgages, degrees, promotions with party photos. They didn't understand work that left no ribbon to cut. They couldn't see value in a life that couldn't be recited in LinkedIn headlines or wrapped up in a holiday card. But I wasn't living for a family narrative. I was living for survival, for impact, for people like Jada who could smell wind shifts better than Doppler radar, like Cam who kept the rookie calm even while his own ankle was swelling in his boot. People who knew that leadership isn't loud, it's present. At 7:15, I glanced at my watch. Sunlight had cracked over the horizon, softening the trees in gold. I took one last breath of pine and walked back to the truck. The silence stayed with me, clean and earned. By 8:12, I was back at the hotel. I showered, changed, folded my gear the way I always did in the field, neat, deliberate, prepared. Every step was ritual. Every movement, an act of self-respect. At 5:50 p.m., I pulled into Erin's driveway. The scene was magazine-perfect, manicured lawn champagne flutes on the porch rail, white folding chairs facing string lights. I parked at the edge and took a slow breath. No one greeted me. Erin glanced over and waved vaguely toward the side entrance like I was there to refill the drinks. Inside the kitchen buzzed with music and muffled laughter. I passed a hallway of carefully curated photos, weddings, baby showers, framed diplomas. I kept walking. My coat stayed on. My mother stood at the kitchen counter slicing kiwi into perfect stars. She didn't look up. "Did you stay somewhere else last night?" she asked. "Yes," I said evenly. "I needed space." She gave a small nod. "Erin will be glad you came." She was wrong, but I didn't say it, because I wasn't there for Erin. I stepped into the den. The air felt filtered, too clean, too rehearsed. I looked at the wall of degrees, gold-trimmed frames lined up like trophies. None of them carried smoke. None carried weight. I thought of Bravo Team, of the way they'd waited for my voice on that channel, the way they moved because I told them they could. I thought of Cam limping beside me as we cleared the line, still cracking jokes. I thought of the gear I'd packed and repacked, the maps I'd memorized, the nights I lay awake doing math to save strangers. They called me a drifter, but I wasn't drifting. I was anchoring teams in chaos. I glanced at the clock. 6:29. And then I heard it. A car door. Not rushed, not hesitant, just sure. I didn't need to look. I already knew. The knock at the side door wasn't loud. In fact, it barely registered over the sound of my sister's playlist pulsing from a speaker near the window. But I heard it. Maybe because I had been listening for it all day. Or maybe because some part of me, deeper than breath, older than memory, knew that this was the moment my father had once told me would come. A moment where everything would stay still, and only one person in the room would understand why. I didn't move right away. I let them greet him first. Through the living room archway, I could see Erin pause at the door. She opened it, smiling that polite, cautious smile we reserve for unexpected guests, men in uniforms especially. Can I help you?" she asked, her voice, sweet, a little unsure. "I believe you can," the man said. His voice was calm, measured, steady. "I'm here for Maya." That was the first ripple. Her head tilted, confused. "Maya," he nodded. "Maya Bennett." She turned toward the den where I was standing quietly just behind the armchair. Her brows furrowed. "Maya, someone's here for you." I stepped forward slowly, smoothing my shirt as I walked. My hands weren't shaking, not even a little. When I reached the doorway, the room had already begun to fall quiet. Not completely, just enough to feel the tension shift like air thinning before a storm. My mother had moved toward the hall. My brother leaned forward from the kitchen island, now watching with interest. And there he stood, Colonel James Stratton, the man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with my father in Iraq, who had trained entire platoons, commanded rescue operations, and led more men than I could count. He was in full dress uniform, deep navy coat pressed to perfect lines, silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, campaign ribbons stitched neatly above the heart. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at me. "Maya," he said as if we were picking up from the middle of a conversation. "5 years today." "Yes, sir," I replied quietly. He took 2 steps forward, then stopped standing just 3 feet from me. The entire room had fallen into stillness now. Even the music had faded to the background like it knew it wasn't the most important thing anymore. "I served with your father for 8 years, Colonel Stratton said to the room. Not to me, not to anyone in particular, just aloud. I knew him as a leader, a man of principle, and one of the finest soldiers I've ever known." No one interrupted. He turned to face me again. "He told me once if anything ever happened to him that I should find you. Not out of duty, but out of respect." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Not sealed, just folded. I took it without a word. I knew what it was. My father's handwritten request. A note he'd left with Stratton years ago. I didn't need to open it now. I had memorized it before I ever left Colorado. But what happened next was not written in any letter. Colonel Stratton squared his shoulders. And then, without hesitation, he lifted his right hand and saluted me. Full form. No shortcuts. A formal military salute offered not as an obligation, but as a recognition. A declaration. The room, for a moment, seemed to lose sound. I didn't return the salute. That wasn't my place. I simply stood there and absorbed it. Every breath I'd taken in smoke-heavy air, every silent night on a cot near the edge of flame, every time I was called a helper instead of a leader. Every piece of it stood inside that gesture. I nodded once. "Thank you, Colonel." He lowered his hand. "He was proud of you. I wanted you to know that. And I wanted them to know it too." He didn't look at anyone in particular, but his eyes passed over the faces that had spent the last 24 hours talking over me, around me, about me. My sister cleared her throat. "I didn't know you were military." "I'm not," I said calmly. "But my father was. And I followed something he believed in. That was enough." My mother stepped forward slightly. "Maya, what is this?" "It's the truth," I replied. "The version you never asked for." For a second, I thought she might say something else. Defend herself. Apologize. Try to soften the moment. But she didn't. No one did. Because there was nothing to say. The silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't tense. It was the kind of silence that comes after a truth too large to be ignored has finally entered the room. Colonel Stratton reached out, gently placed a hand on my shoulder, and gave it one firm squeeze. Then he turned, tipped his head respectfully to the rest of the room, and walked out the same door he came through. No one followed. No one moved. And I stood there, not triumphant, not smug, just grounded. I walked back to the table, picked up my coat, and slid my arms into the sleeves. My brother finally spoke. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I wasn't angry, just clear. "Because you weren't listening." I buttoned the top of my coat, turned toward the door, and stepped out into the golden hush of early evening. The sky had shifted again, softening toward dusk. I could still feel the imprint of the colonel's hand on my shoulder, and the air around me was finally blissfully still. I didn't need applause. I didn't need closure. I just needed that moment, and it came, exactly as it was supposed to. I didn't hear the door close behind me, didn't glance back to see who was still watching through the living room windows. Some exits don't need witnesses. They need air and peace, and the kind of stillness that follows after something heavy has finally been put down. I walked slowly toward my car, the gravel soft beneath my boots, each step deliberate. Aaron's garden lights flickered along the path like they couldn't decide whether to stay lit or surrender to the dusk. One by one, I passed them, leaving behind the house, the porch, the curated family image that had never once made room for someone like me. At the driver's door, I paused. My hands rested on the steering wheel, not gripping, just grounding. I looked out across the yard. The windows were glowing, now dim silhouettes behind glass. Inside that room, a man in full military dress had just saluted a woman no one expected to matter, and no one had said a single word. They didn't clap. They didn't ask questions. They just stood there, silent, startled, suspended. It was the most honest thing they'd ever done. Because for once, they couldn't spin it. They couldn't shrink it down to something explainable. There was no polite laugh, no eye roll, no easy dismissal. Just the weight of a truth too heavy to decorate. I didn't need applause. I needed them to sit in that stillness, to finally feel the discomfort of everything they had refused to see. The engine started with a quiet rumble. I pulled out slowly, the tires whispering along the asphalt. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I'd cleared the mailbox. And even then, I didn't slow down. The drive back to the hotel took 34 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't touch my phone. Just the hum of the road and the pine trees slipping past my window, tall and unbothered. There's a kind of peace that comes after a storm, not relief exactly, but recognition. Like the world rearranged itself and you're no longer swimming upstream. I parked outside the hotel and walked in under the blue glow of the welcome back sign. Funny how that one small phrase felt more sincere than anything I'd heard from my own family in years. Back in the room, I slipped off my coat and placed the envelope from Colonel Stratton on the nightstand. I didn't need to open it. I already knew every word. My father's handwriting etched in memory. The strongest people don't always speak. But when they do, the right ones listen. Tonight, I had spoken. Not with a speech, not with confrontation, but by standing still while a decorated Marine saluted me in front of the very people who never once asked who I'd become. That salute wasn't for theatrics. It wasn't for show. It was for history, for legacy, for my father, and for me. I opened the curtains slightly. The moon was rising white, full, patient. I stood there and let it spill across the carpet. The night was still. My phone sat on the edge of the dresser, unmoved, unlit. No messages, no missed calls. Not from my mother, not from Aaron, not from anyone. And I wasn't surprised. Because people don't know what to do with the truth, especially when it doesn't serve the version of you they prefer. I left them with that silence. Not out of pettiness, but because that silence was theirs to sit in now. I stepped back outside with a cup of coffee from the lobby, sat on a bench beneath a dim parking lot light, watching the wind tug gently at the branches beyond the fence line. And I thought of the people who did see me, of Jada, who could read wind like language, of Cam, who once carried his own fear like it was someone else's to make the rookies feel safe, of Luis, who clapped my shoulder that night and said, "You saved us." Of every person who looked at me and saw more than a missing resume or an empty chair at Christmas. They never called me a drifter. They called me steady. They called me back. At 10:07 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. One message. You made him proud. You make us all proud. JS. I stared at it for a long moment. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That message had said more than a room full of relatives ever had. The next morning, I woke before the sun again. Out of habit, out of rhythm. I folded my clothes, zipped my bag, made a checklist in my head the way I always did before deployment. Water supply. Keys. Credentials. Go bag. But this time it wasn't for an emergency. It was for clarity. At the front desk, a young woman offered me a breakfast bar and a banana from the snack tray. She smiled like I mattered, like no explanation was required. "Safe travels," she said, and meant it. On the flight back to Denver, I didn't sleep. I looked out the window as the terrain shifted, forests giving way to farmland, farmland breaking into desert veins. The country looked quiet from above, but I knew better. I knew how much burned beneath what looked still. When I landed, the mountains rose to greet me. I drove home, unpacked slowly, and hung my gear exactly where it belonged. I refilled my canisters, checked the emergency folder, ran my fingers over the embroidered patch inside my pack, unsung and unstoppable. Then I stepped outside. The air was colder here, crisper. The porch creaked under my boots. The sun was just beginning to rise, washing the trees in that blue before gold that always made me feel alive. I breathed in. This was the life I had built. This was the life they never asked about. But it existed. It endured. It mattered. And now they had seen enough of it that they could never fully unsee. They would remember the uniform. They would remember the salute. They would remember the moment the quietest person in the room was the one being honored. And even if they never spoke of it again, they knew. They finally knew. What stays with me is not the salute, but the silence that followed. That rare kind of stillness when truth stands tall and everyone else has to sit with it. If you've ever been written off just because you lived life on your own terms, subscribe to Revenge with Seren, where quiet strength always gets the last word.